Hi there, welcome to Fireside with Peter Adkison. I'm Peter Adkison, my co-host is Emma Larkins, and our guest today is Jonathan Tweet, and we are broadcasting live on Gen Con TV. We are also here, this is our very first show of a new season where we are going to explore Dungeons and Dragons, specifically the era that I was involved in, and the people I know were involved in back in the late 90s, 3rd edition, D20, the acquisition by Wizards of TSR. And so we're going to have a whole bunch of ex-Wizards, or currently maybe Wizards and ex-TSR people on the show. I've learned a lot of them have moved back to the Midwest, so that's going to be kind of tricky. But anyway, we are also broadcasting here from Chaldea Studios. And as you know, on this show, we go in search of the untold stories behind your favorite games. And Dungeons and Dragons is, well, that's a clear favorite for me, and I'm sure for all of you as well. Our guest today has some great stories about Dungeons and Dragons. Jonathan Tweet has a long history as an RPG designer, worked on 3rd edition, was at Wizards before the acquisition, and he's a good friend of mine. I can't wait. So, Jonathan, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Peter. This is great.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, what we like to do is we like to start with a little bit of like, who was Jonathan Tweet before? Yeah. Well, let's say before being involved with Wizards of the Coast, sure. And then there's a little bit of history there before the TSR acquisition. So let's start before Wizards. You worked at a number of game companies and did some really important RPGs before we even met.
Yeah, that's right. So I was part of this crew of people in Northfield, Minnesota that included Mark Reinhagen and Lisa Stevens and John Nephew. And we, especially like Mark Reinhagen and I, were the co-creators of the Ars Magica game line, and I think all those people worked on it to one degree or another.
Let's say something about Ars Magica. Yeah. Like, I mean, it's still a game that is quoted as really ahead of its time and very important. What? Why? What?
Yeah. Tell us more about Ars Magica.
Yeah. Right. So I think Ars Magica was one of the first games that was created by people who had grown up playing role-playing games. The first role-playing games were created by people who had grown up playing war games.
Right.
And so what Mark and I did was we really brought out more of the story in the role-playing game and sort of took it further away from its wargaming roots. And then that was in 1987, but it sort of set off this whole 90s renaissance in role-playing games that were more story and character-oriented.
Sure, and Jonathan Tweet, of course, Mark Reinhagen, of course, would go on, along with Lisa Stevens and the Wick brothers, to do Vampire the Masquerade.
That's right.
So it seems like a natural evolution of that sort of take on role-playing games. You also did Over the Edge.
Yeah, that's right. So after the business partnership broke up, between Mark Reinhagen and me, I started freelancing, and Over the Edge was the role-playing game actually that I created with the idea that I was never going to publish it. And so
the Prime Order. Got it.
Yeah. And since I was never going to publish it, I could make it as weird and as freeform as I wanted, and I made the kind of role-playing game that I had never played before. Right. And John Nephew heard about it and insisted on publishing it. I told him it was not really meant to be publishable, and he said that's what he wanted to publish was.
Yeah, and John, this was with Atlas Games.
That's John Nephew of Atlas Games. That's right.
So what was it about Over the Edge? I mean, I know really give us a taste of this sort of wild, weird,
Exactly. So the point of the game is I wanted people to be able to sort of start playing right away and to be able to come up with a really interesting character without having to read the rule book first. For Ars Magica, you have to read the rule book before you can do anything, before you can even start thinking about your character. Okay. So Over the Edge is, it's a modern day setting. It's on a weird fictional island where anything can happen. And so you can sort of just create whatever character you come up with out of your head.
Right.
And because it's the modern day, you can bring in all the details that you know personally from the world and anything that interests you. And because it has this sort of anything goes, your character can be a psychic or, be mind controlled by satellites or.
And there's a lot of conspiracy stuff.
It's all about
right?
us. Exactly.
Lots of weird conspiracy stuff happening in the book.
That's right. So this was actually before X-Files.
Before X-Files. Wow. Right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. But it had that X-Files vibe of there are these weird things going on in the real world under the surface.
And I think that I didn't play it back in the early '90s when it was when it came out.
Yeah, like 92.
92.
Yeah.
But I became interested in it much later when other people that I respected started referring back to
That's
it.
right.
People like Ron Edwards and designers of now that we associate with the indie RPG movement from started in the turn of the century. They were all looking back and saying Over the Edge was so ahead of its time and formulative. So for
Vincent Baker,
yes,
yeah, Jason Morningstar,
yeah.
No, it's really I'm really honored by how much people, people sort of picked up that banner of, hey, you could do new things with role-playing games. Right. And now they're doing things that sort of surprise me and seem a little, that's too weird. Can you do that? But it's great to see. I'm really happy to have been part of that.
Right. Well, we're going to bookend the show by Over the Edge.
Yeah.
So help me remember.
All right.
Because,
Fantastic.
we're going to do a callback at the end.
Yeah.
Okay. So how did all this lead to you getting associated with Wizards of the Coast?
Right. So Lisa Stevens ended up working at Wizards of the Coast as I think the first paid employee, and so she had worked.
There's a rivalry between Lisa Stevens and Beverly Marshall Salem. We have to be careful. Beverly Marshall Salem was the first paid employee. Lisa was the first full-time paid employee. That's the way I understand it.
Okay,
anyway,
all right.
Yeah, so they both got some right there. Yes, but Lisa came out and helped and joined us in 1991.
And she had already been around, so like she knew the industry and she had contacts and she
right, exactly.
So she knew freelancers,
She knew freelancers
like me, and so she got in contact with me about this cool game company she was working with in Washington State, and maybe I could do some work for it. And so I remember I took a look at the original Primal Order manuscript, and but Talislanta was the big. Sort of my big inroad to working at Wizards of the Coast was, Stephen Michael Sacchi's game, Talislanta.
Yeah, because when Lisa came to work for us, it was really, you love it when you hire somebody, you've really hired an executive when they come to you with new revenue, right? And she says, hey, you hired me, how about we pick up this game line with 14 products in inventory? And I'm like, that sounds interesting.
This is Talislanta?
Talislanta.
You want to talk a little bit about Talislanta?
Well, tell us about third edition at least. And
sure.
Talislanta.
So the interesting thing about Talislanta is that its original game rules came out the same year as Ars Magica with sort of a similar mechanical system. And Cyberpunk came out about the same time with also a similar system. So I think there was a lot of people angling towards simplifying and streamlining the way mechanics worked. And so that was pretty interesting to see. I really liked the system in Talislanta. It's sort of a streamlined D20 system, you could say. And you folks were going to do a third edition.
Right.
And you hired me to do the introductory adventure and to bring the magic rules up to final format.
Yeah, and then eventually it led you to writing the third edition.
And then I got on the phone and I said, this game has enough issues that you should hire me to do the whole thing. Do the whole thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You want to do it right.
I think I started it and I was going to do an adventure, and then I said, you'd need someone to do the magic system, like me maybe.
Yeah.
And then you said, and I said, and also I could
do the whole thing.
While we're at it. So that was my first third edition that I ever did for Wizards of the Coast.
Right, the first third edition.
Yeah, was third edition of Talislanta. And it's a nice, clean little system. It's got great art. It's got a sort of a unique world.
It's a fantasy world.
All the creatures and the fantasy races are sort of one-offs. It's all so you don't see elves and dwarves, but you'll see gnomekin and lizard people and the demon people or whatever. And they're all drawn in interesting ways. Stephen said she had a really good artists, and especially for the 80s, the art that came out.
PD Bringing Black.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's right. Yeah. So it was a really fun property to work with, and there was the rule set was mostly done, but it hadn't been put into place for like, how is someone going to learn it, or what's going to be the easiest way to start a campaign, and all that kind of stuff that I did with the introductory adventure and whatever to sort of make it easy to get going.
We actually have someone in chat. Kathy Wapu says, "I loved Talislanta."
Oh, hi, Kathy. I love Kat. Yeah, that's great.
Hey, Kathy.
Yeah. So one other game system to touch on briefly before we get to D&D is Everway.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So when I came to Wizards of the Coast, I had 2 game pitches, and one was a new agey, fancy, image-oriented, kind of spiritual, multicultural game, and the other was sort of a face-to-face martial arts brawling fighting game.
Right.
And people really loved the new agey game, and that turned out to be Everway. And the idea is you create your character based on image cards that you pick, so that you, instead of reading a book to try to figure out what your character is, you look at these cards and you come up with these stories. And in the same way that Over the Edge is set up where you can create whatever character you want because it's anything goes, Everway is set up to be you can create whatever you want because these people travel from world to world. So if you want to be from Ice World, you can your friend can create someone who's from Desert World, and you can adventure together, and you don't have to worry about finding a place on a map for your character to come from because there are all these worlds across the universe that you could hail from.
Great. So you started you started at Wizards what year?
So I was hired on the end of '93. I didn't move out till '94.
Okay. So and while you were there, you went to Talislanta and then Everway. Let's fast forward to one other thing. Let's fast forward to D&D.
Sure.
Yeah. I know you also did some work on Magic, but let's get to D&D.
Netrunner.
Yep. Magic Netrunner. Yes. So I remember what I was going through in this period of time, which was trying to figure out how we should grow and how intelligent ways to spend money other than giving it back to shareholders. And and so we came up on the idea, on the opportunity to acquire TSR and Dungeons and Dragons in 1997. I always say every date with a question mark because the memory's getting a little fuzzy after all these years.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's go to that moment. When did you first hear that this might be in the works, that we might be at Wizards, because we were good friends by this time, we might be acquiring TSR and Dungeons and Dragons, and what was your reaction to that? Or do you have some thoughts about that moment?
I was not on the inside track, so I heard about it, but I think I heard about it when pretty much everybody heard about it. In '95, you had cut my Everway line, and we laid off everyone that was reporting to me. And now 2 years later, we're going to buy somebody else's role-playing game. That's fine. I think those were both smart moves.
Well, it's a tough decision. Well, I remember saying when we had to close down our RPG efforts, Everway and Slay Industries and other RPGs we were doing. We even did Ars Magica.
Had Ars Magica. That's right.
I had just come to the conclusion there was no way you could make money in this category unless you had the number one game in the category, which at the time was D&D. Maybe Vampire and Masquerade, but. So we had the chance to get D&D. It was like, well, okay, we're back in the role-playing game business now. Let's go back in. Yeah. So did you have some thoughts of what you might like? Did you suddenly get oh wow, it's D&D? I wonder what I could do with D&D. Like what?
So
and you've done some freelance work on D&D. Is that right?
So I had done freelance work for D&D. Right. Well, I've been playing D&D, started in '77.
Okay.
And
a year before me. Fine.
Okay.
Fine.
It was the very end of '77.
Okay.
So I might not have played.
I was the end of '78 too, so that's okay.
Yeah. And like I hacked D&D from the ground up for the campaign that I ran in high school. And so I sort of was already used to messing with the D&D rules.
Right.
But what I figured I would do is I would work on some ancillary product like a D&D style game for the Dominia setting that Magic is in.
Right.
I didn't think that I was going to work on the core rules. Also because it wasn't clear what that would look like, right? Like that's a really daunting task to take this, big story game and change it in a way that people are going to accept.
Right. Well, and I remember you being one of my few allies in the idea of doing a Dominaria, Magic the Gathering setting as a setting for D&D. And in fact, I had when I had to present to the Wizards Board of Directors the idea of acquiring TSR, I listed that as one of the synergies of like, hey, we could take these two lines and cross them over. We could do a role-playing, a D&D setting set in Dominaria. Yeah. And boy, that went down like a turd in church, let me tell you. I was like, there were not very many people. Nobody on the Magic team wanted to be associated with D&D, and nobody from TSR wanted to be associated. I shouldn't say associated with. That makes it sound like nobody wanted to even do lunch. But I mean, like, nobody wanted the brands to cross. Right. But you had before we had to face that.
Yeah. I thought it was a great idea.
You thought it was a great idea. I thought it was a great idea. I got to play test.
We were play testing different versions, a board game kind of version where you would like go into a dungeon and try to take down the portals to Phyrexia or whatever. Right. It seemed pretty cool.
And I found it. When we were doing that, I found it really. I was doing some play testing even in my own Chaldea game at the time. I thought it was very inspirational. Yeah. To look at a magic card and see the magic abilities of a creature or an artifact, and then kind of try and translate that into Dungeons and Dragons terms.
That's right.
Like just having that kicker to kind of point you in a direction made it so much fun to work on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that the magic powers, when a creature has has a power in magic, it's an interesting power that's worth the type, right? Like, it wouldn't be on that card unless it meant something. But a lot of D&D creatures were sort of built sort of like, well, what would a 7-foot-tall ogre be like? Well, it would probably have these stats. And it's not interesting. It's just like, well, whatever. Now you've got a 7-foot-tall ogre, and that's your right. And so you're right that Dominia had these interesting creatures with abilities that made you wonder about them, like the kobolds, where you'd have a kobold sergeant would give the kobold masses these bonus abilities.
Right. And slivers and all sorts of crazy, wacky
that's right.
things. Yeah. It was a sad moment when I eventually decided, well, let's kill that line too.
Yeah, well.
Oh my gosh. And so we acquired TSR.
Yeah.
We gave job offers to most everybody that was associated with TSR. Most of them accepted and moved out to Seattle. Do you remember did you forge any friendships, or do you remember anybody you were excited to meet that had been involved in D&D or any?
It was a pretty strange onboarding, I have to say, right? Like, because they came over sort of as a group.
Yeah.
And so there was a big enough group that they didn't have to mingle. And there was definitely a split. There was the card side of R&D, and there was a role-playing side of R&D, and the cultures were different, and the interests were different, and the people were different, and the history was different. And so
it was hard to kind of make those relationships.
Yeah, it was pretty hard. I got into like a game on lunches, like a 1 hour every Friday dungeon lunch that one of the old timers ran. So I got to like hang out with some of the people there, and but it wasn't until sort of I ended up on the team and proved what I could do that people took me seriously and
right. Yeah.
And where were they coming from?
Lake Geneva, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Yep, the home.
So a very big change of scenery too.
The original home of Dungeons and Dragons
Yeah.
in Lake
Yeah.
Geneva. Yeah.
Yeah.
And some of them moved back there, like Skip Williams lives there now, I think, and a bunch of others.
Yep, Sue Weiland.
Yeah. And and they all have reasons to get together and reminisce because Gary Gygax's son Luke runs GaryCon there now, and I go there once in a while. It's great. Anyway, so very quickly after acquiring TSR, we announced that we were going to do a third edition
Yeah,
Dungeons and Dragons almost immediately, almost day one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what did people think about that?
Oh, I think there was. I think everybody was pretty receptive to the idea.
So I've got the answer to that question.
Okay.
Okay. So and I hope you can back this up.
Okay, well, I'll try.
Right.
We'll see.
That if you talked with D&D players, do you want a third edition? They'd be like, no, right? Because they already had to switch to second edition. It wasn't worth switching. It didn't make the game all that much better.
And that was only 12 years earlier.
And they did not want to do that again, right? And so right. But then if you would say, well, if we had to do a third edition, are there any changes you would make? And then they would list all the problems with the game and all the things that needed to be fixed.
Yeah.
And so, if you heard what they said, no, they didn't want an edition. But if you listened, they were ready for a new edition.
Right.
Yeah.
So obviously, I really wanted the TSR people who moved out to be really involved in making third edition.
Yeah.
So we organized a third edition design team. Original design members: Skip Williams, Rich Baker, Monty Cook, who's going to be my guest here in a couple of weeks.
Good.
So that'll be great. And the acquisition of TSR came with Ryan Dancy.
Yeah. Thank goodness.
who had brokered,
Right.
played a strategic role in brokering the whole deal to acquire TSR, and so we'll get into that in a couple of weeks. It was funny because I told Ryan, I said, okay, listen, and I put him in charge of running the brand of Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and I told Ryan right off the bat, I said, okay, I'm going to put you in charge of running the brand of Dungeons and Dragons, but you're not going to have anything to do with third edition. I'm going to form a design team, and they're going to report directly to me because I have a lot of opinions about how I want this game to go.
And you did.
Yeah, I did have a lot of opinions. Well, I'd started working a year later, in 1978, started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I had 20 years of house rules.
Right, you had hacked it. You hacked it more than I did. I think.
Hacked it a lot because I just refused to give up on it. And so, at some point, but you weren't involved in that at first.
That's
but
right.
you pitched a couple other ideas for D&D or for TSR style games
That's
around.
right.
Yeah. So tell us about
Yeah.
that. There was a Gamma World something.
Exactly.
Right?
So I like I said, I was on the margins. I was working on the fringes.
Right.
And so I was doing this Dominia stuff, whatever, not part of the main line.
Right.
And then Lisa Stevens was there, and she was in charge of the Odyssey line, which was sort of like the, weird D&D settings that there's no real reason for. And so you put them in this separate line.
Right.
Okay. Like my response would be maybe don't do them. But anyway, there was this line of sort of these weird one-off settings, and I pitched Gamma World.
Okay.
Right? Like I always liked Gamma World as sort of the second coolest thing that TSR did, and you could use the D20 rules.
Right.
They weren't called that yet, but you could use the Dungeons and Dragons rules and create a pretty cool version of Gamma World that has mutants. This is like post-apocalypse, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it's mutants and lasers and whatever, and all that stuff is good in D&D, right?
I loved mutations.
Yeah.
The best part of Gamma World was the random mutations chart.
random
If you
mutations.
there's places where you could go and wander into like heavy radioactive zone, which did not mean you died of radiation poisoning. It meant you rolled percentile dice and got some special ability.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe it's a defect. Maybe it's another leg. Maybe it's laser eyes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was right. But so it was like it's like D&D, but with mutations and bat wings and laser eyes and electric teeth and
and controlling magnetic lines of flux. Yeah,
just
imagine
all sorts of-
going up against a knight with that.
Yeah. So, sort of to my surprise, we got the go-ahead. It was in this weird line that no one cared about. So, and then when Ryan Dancy took over, his big thing was to get people focused back on core D&D, right? Like he took a book that was for the Ravenloft setting, and he said, well, why don't we pull the Ravenloft label off the front? And now it's a D&D book instead of a Ravenloft book, and it sold better than all the other Ravenloft books because it didn't have Ravenloft on it, right? So his thing is, let's all go back to the core D&D experience, and I went to him with my cool pitch, and he said he wouldn't do it in a million years. and I think he was right. Like, you know, in the world where AD&D has a whole bunch of lines that all compete with each other, and we're creating these settings just because they seem cool, even though they're not part of any logical business plan. Then the Gamma World makes sense in that business model.
Yeah.
But in the business model where we're trying to get people back to buying D&D products, Gamma World doesn't make any sense, right?
Yeah.
So he was right.
Yeah. So I think it's funny because this conversation is a lot of like, game designers out there, you should know this is what it's like to be a game designer. You work on a line, it gets canceled. You work on a little line, it gets canceled.
Yeah, that is right.
It's the way it is. So I'm going to tread carefully here because what happens with third edition is that we had some very talented people on the team. Worked a lot of heart and soul, but I wasn't happy. To be honest, like I was having trouble getting a nice connection with them and where I wanted it to go. So kind of glossing over that, and at some point, I said, okay, I need to put in my ringer. And so that had to have been awkward. I threw you into the D&D third edition design team with a bunch of TSR guys who'd worked on Dungeons and Dragons there for career spanning.
That's right.
Epic.
That's right.
And so
and who needed to prove themselves because their whole company had gone under, and now they had to show that it wasn't their fault that it went under. Like they knew what they were doing. So there was a lot emotionally and professionally. There was a lot on the line.
Right. So how'd that go?
Well, what was your role or position, or what was
Good.
your purpose?
Thanks, Emma.
Right. So the three of them had no leader among them. It was a troika, right? And then I was going to do an introductory basic set. Right. That's one of the things that I've worked on for years and years. So that was my beginning, but then it was the beginning of my like official involvement and how I got to know the guys but then at one point their boss brought me into his office and said I was the fourth person on the team, which is, now it's even more awkward because with no leader among three people, that's hard. Among four people, even harder, right? And plus, who is this? And I'm clearly the outsider, right? So it was awkward. It was but we were there to make the game better, right? And we were professionals. We're professionals, and so we worked on it, and I could see that they knew what they were doing, and they could see that I knew what we were doing.
And you told me one story when we were talking about this that I think is a good story to tell here. At one point, Skip Williams really kind of helped you get in a little bit.
He did. He did that twice. There was a.
And for anybody watching who doesn't know, I mean, Skip Williams is a legend.
He goes way back.
He goes way back. Early. I think he started working at TSR like when he was 3 years old or something.
Something like that. So he worked on the monster and treasure assortments that were in my basic set in 1977.
Right.
So he was there, making my dungeon possible.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And he was the sage for the longest time
in Dragon Magazine,
so he'd answer all the terrible questions, right? Like, is it pronounced Flind or Flind, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
so to have his backing was good. He was the first to sort of back my core system. Like I had already come up with what's the core system for D&D for my Dominia games, right? You roll a 20-sided die and you add a bonus for how good you are on your stats, and you add a bonus for your class and level, and that's you try to hit a target number or higher, right?
Yeah.
So I
And
already
the target number being the opponent's armor class.
if you're attacking or make an attack roll, or the difficulty class for the door, how tough is the door, you're trying to make a die roll, it's all this, right? And so I had already sort of come up with that system,
Right.
and they had a very different system that they were floating, and Skip was the first one to say, my system was worth taking a look at and trying, and it turned out to be the system that we went with, so that was good. And then he helped me again when we were doing I was proposing cyclic initiative, because in the game rules
So let's break down cyclic initiative.
Let's break down cyclic initiative.
I think our audience
Let's do
would
it.
love us to dive into a mechanic
it's a great
of
story.
3rd edition.
I agree.
Yeah. So
Edition.
let's give the mechanic guys and gals a
Okay.
a little thing.
So you played a lot more, whatever, second than
Oh
I did.
yeah, I could set this up really well.
Okay, go.
AD&D.
Yeah.
You try to the initiative surprise rules with the weapon speeds and speed factors was incomprehensible. In fact, I've actually recently had a hankering to try and actually figure it out, because everybody.
And you were something like a computer guy, right?
Yeah,
like
I was a computer guy.
If you can't
and
figure
I
it
couldn't
out.
figure it out. And so it's funny, is recently out in just last week, I was out in the Midwest with Jeff Martin of True Dungeon fame. And he played a ton of AD&D. And so I asked him, you're a guru of AD&D.
Yeah.
Explain to me how initiative worked in AD&D. And he just kind of rolled his eyes and says, nobody knows. I said, wait, what? You play? No, nobody played the way it was in AD&D.
Right.
So by the way, if you're watching and you can explain the AD&D initiative system, the way it's in the rules, not your house rules
Not your house
for
rules.
it, because
Yeah,
that's too easy. Like really how it worked according to the way it was in Gary's mind.
Yeah.
Tell me. Okay. So anyway, so that's what D&D was.
Right. And one of the key features there is that you would roll initiative every round.
Right.
So some rounds you would go first, sometimes you would go last. That means your character might go twice in a row. If you go last one round and first the next round,
Yeah.
you're gonna. So
Well, that sounds kind of fun.
it does sound kind of fun. Like on paper, it seems great, right? And there's also sort of like this declarations phase where everyone declares what they're going to do before they see how the dice roll, so that I might declare that I'm going to run across the room and kick open the door, but by the time my turn actually happens, I realize, I wish that instead I was running over there to heal them, but I already declared I'm running over the right. So you do that. That also sounds great.
That
right?
sounds cool, because it sounds kind of
cool.
realistic. I want to do this. No. Yeah. That's why I did house rules, is because I used to do big scale D&D fights.
Okay,
So
right.
like
I remember
50, 60 miniatures
I
out
was
on
in
the
one of those.
table.
Yeah.
That would, And you couldn't do declarations for what 50 characters are going to do. I mean, you could, it's just like, anyway.
So, the way that I learned out of that basic box was you just went in order of who had the highest dexterity. And so you would just always go in a circle, right? Highest dexterity first every time. It was really fast. Everyone knew what order you went in. Right. And this whole business of rolling every round, then it takes forever to go through the round because no one knows who's next. People get dropped. Like on paper, it seems interesting because you're forced to make decisions ahead of time. You have to adapt to the situations as they change, and it sounds great.
Right.
But then when you actually play, it's slow. People are sitting around. Whose turn is it? Wait, I should have done it.
Except that never happens because nobody plays that way. Everybody just has their house rules.
So everyone just has their house rules.
Right.
And so I sort of said to the group, I really want to try this cyclical initiative. It's always seemed to work for me. It's like it's what I had tried in the playtest with Dominaria and whatever. But it's so different from what was written in the rules. And
so different than from AD&D.
From AD&D.
Or second edition AD&D. Right.
And so I was like, but you know what? It's probably just so different that even if it's better, people would not like it. And Skip said, well, let's try it. Right. And we played one battle using initiative that goes around in a circle instead of being different every round. Right. And it was like just so much faster.
Yeah.
Right.
And then it feels more like combat because it's faster. And
Yeah.
so now you're having this much fun in this much time.
Yeah.
Well,
Right.
that's better,
Right.
right? It means that by the end of the turn, at the end of the 5 hours you've been playing D&D, you've had way more fun just
Right.
because things have gone faster.
Yeah.
Right.
So that was one of the big things that really that I learned from that experience is how well people took to a rule that on paper they rejected, but in practice they saw how well it played,
Right.
and
Yeah.
and speed really is part of that. Just that
Right.
having things happen faster.
Right.
Playtesting. Turns out it works.
Playtesting turns out to be really valuable.
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, let's stay on mechanics for a moment.
Yeah.
What other interesting stories can we drum up about how you left your fingerprints on third edition?
Well, there's the
D&D?
grapple rules.
Which all the Pathfinder fans say the grapple rules suck in third edition.
Wow.
Oh.
That's why.
fired.
No, that's why I bring them up, right? That is the
You mean third edition is
messiest-
not perfect?
The grapple rules are the messiest, most complicated, whatever. Like, what my overriding design goal for the grapple rules was, I didn't want grappling to be so good that you would discover that it turns out to be the best option. And now it's like, oh, the orcs, instead of hitting you with your sword, they're all grappling you. And now the game, it's like, oh, yeah, that actually makes sense because of the way the rules work.
Yeah.
And so it had to really be punishing unless you got everything right. It couldn't just be the sort of thing where, oh, I happen to get these 2 feats and now I'm going to grapple everything from now on. And
Right.
Yeah.
right. And then
Grapple the dragon, grapple the grapple the halfling. It's like sumo D&D.
Yeah. So
Right.
I mean, like, there was a problem with the unarmed combat rules in second edition where you could have a pretty good chance of knocking somebody out flat if you had a high strength and you were fighting unarmed. So it's like, oh, they've got 100 hit points. Well, the best thing to do is punch them because you've got a 1 in 8 chance of just knocking them out.
Knocking them out.
Right. And so I wanted to avoid that, and I did. The grappling rules are so punishing that people are not going to make the mistake of using them instead of fighting with a sword. I had a.
There you go. So there's a design trick. If there's a certain part of the game you don't want players to engage in with too much, just kind of botch the rules
Make
a
it-
little bit.
yeah.
Yeah.
Don't don't make it easy for
I'm
them.
glad I didn't know this at the time. Yeah. No.
So-
I think that's all reasonable. That's all reasonable.
So I did finally. I got punished myself though in a game of third edition where there was a little imp that was
Right.
bothering us, and I didn't have the magic weapon I needed, and I thought, well, it's tiny, it's small. I'll just use the grappling rules.
Right.
Right. Like it's like I'll just grab it and then it can't fly away. And so. Sure enough, it's so small and weak, whatever. My character grabbed it. I felt really good, and then it was used as an escape artist trait because I also said that demons have a ton of skill points.
Yeah.
And so all the demons just have like, so actually that made perfect sense that I tried to grab this thing. It didn't work because it's a screwy demon and they're really good at getting away from you.
Yeah.
Right.
So there you go. I got punished by
you
my own grappling rules.
Well, it just warms my heart.
And I felt like that's how it should be.
Yeah.
I did the rules right. I failed just like I was supposed to.
Right. So I think there was also an interesting, I remember a lot of discussions, and Scaff jumped in on discussions about like facing. Like in
Yes.
AD&D,
Yes.
when you played AD&D,
Oh, that's another really good one.
your miniatures had a facing, which you may not, like in 3rd edition, I don't think 5th edition has facing. We won't talk about 4th edition on this show. Facing was a thing way back in the day, and we got rid of facing.
That's right.
So tell us about that.
So
How did that happen?
I'm not clear what the 2nd edition facing rules are either. I think that's a lot like initiative. I think people do it different ways.
I don't know either. I only bothered with the odd numbered editions of D&D.
Okay. All right. So we wanted the rules for combat to be so clear that people would play them the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
And that way you can balance the game. You can't balance the game if these people are playing that way and those people are playing another way.
Right.
You can't do organized play
Yep.
if in every city they play different, right?
Right,
So
right.
things had to be formalized.
Well, yeah, and I want to interject here too. One of my goals with 3rd edition D&D is that I wanted to make the rules bring them forward, make them. I
Yes.
always get so.
Yeah.
I get so frustrated with people saying, "Well, AD&D is so much easier." Bull.
Yeah.
It's not easier.
Right.
It's not easier. If it's easier for you, it's because you're not playing with all the rules and you
That's
just
right.
threw it. And so AD&D would make the rules easier by hiding.
That's right.
Hiding,
Right.
hiding a lot of the stuff in the DMG
Yeah.
and
Right.
stuff. So so.
And what we wanted everyone to play the same way, and that meant you had to know what the actual rules were. And so we were pretty well in your face with what the rules were.
Right.
But so we had to figure out facing. We couldn't hand wave it, right? It had to really work.
Right.
And the worst thing about facing is if my miniature is sitting on a map facing a direction, you could take your miniature and sort of walk them around behind me and then hit me from behind, and that seems weird, right? Like you wouldn't see that in a movie.
Bonus for striking from behind.
Get a bonus from striking
In
from
AD&D, there was bonuses for striking on the flank.
Yeah.
Bigger bonus for striking from the rear. Yeah. You had to worry about which side somebody's shield was on.
That's
if they had a shield, because their armor class or the shield bonus was only on that side.
Yeah.
That's right.
If you really dug into rules, you'd find that. But
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. So if you want to avoid somebody going around the back to backstab somebody, like just doing a do-si-do around them or whatever, you can say that on somebody else's turn I can turn to face them, and that's reasonable. But what if there's already other people, multiple people are attacking me? Can I spin every time? What if I turn my back to somebody? So we had this, maybe there'll be like an attack of opportunity. If someone comes to me, so I turn to face them, and then I expose my back to you, then maybe you get an attack of opportunity against me at a bonus, pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Pretty complicated.
Well, I remember we tried to design those rules.
Yes.
We experimented.
We played
around
that.
with
We played them. Yeah.
Facing rules during 3rd edition D&D, and it was a mess.
And there was also a version where you could sort of walk away from one character and go over and hit the other. Right. And so, like, if you were fighting 4 ogres, everyone would swarm on one ogre and fight that ogre. Then everyone would swarm on the other ogre, right? Because there was no.
If they were smart. Now, a lot of players weren't that smart, but yeah.
That's right. And we wanted a game that would stand up to rough play. We wanted. We wanted people who were going to take it seriously and push and try to win. And Scaff was really great for that. And you were great for that. Right.
Hell yeah.
Yeah. Right. You want to win.
Right.
And so. We introduced the attack of opportunity rules to try to, which I think worked out pretty well.
I like the OPI rules.
Right?
Yeah.
So it's like you can ignore that person if you want, but then you suffer a swing, right? And then maybe you care, maybe you don't. So it seems really good. But luckily, Scaff was working on sort of a board game version of Dungeons and Dragons, and they needed to simplify things. So they were taking what we were doing on 3rd edition and trying to simplify them streamline them even more to come up with a fast board game experience. And the rule that they came up with for flanking was the 3rd edition rule for flanking, which is if you bookend somebody, then each of you bookending them gets a bonus.
Meaning two characters attacking somebody from opposite sides.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that worked out great.
Yeah, and which meant that, and the result of that is we just threw out facing all
You don't have to worry about facing.
There's no facing, which is,
you don't worry about where the shield is or all that kind of stuff. It's so much easier.
So much easier.
Yeah. And also, I mean, it sounds like you were playing with minis a lot of the time. I don't know as much what it was like back then, but I know for me, like, people aren't always playing with minis.
That's right.
So if you don't have a mini, it probably becomes even harder. It's like, where are you facing?
Exactly. Whereas
And
the
if not everyone
flanking, you
was.
can sort of picture that in your head, right?
Well, and I think it's fair to say that before 3rd edition, people were playing with miniatures even less, percentage-wise.
That's right.
Like,
Interesting.
it was D&D, AD&D, 2nd edition AD&D had a higher percentage of sort of theater of the mind sort of attitude.
I think that's right.
That people, you're not really on a hex grid, you're not really trying, or square grid, you're not necessarily using miniatures and all that tactical stuff.
mean, the
even
movement
though
rules-
it's in the rules.
Yeah. But
But it was. But we really wanted to codify it and have it hold up as a miniatures game. And part of it was this initiative that we wanted to have a D&D miniatures game, which we eventually ended up not really doing.
Right.
But
we
again,
did
another
D&D
game line canceled.
That's right. But we did D&D miniatures, right?
Yeah,
we did
yeah,
metal
yeah.
miniatures, and we did chainmail miniatures, and then plastic miniatures.
But eventually it was just to play D&D with. It wasn't
that's right.
to do a thing. So somewhere during all that, you ended up being the lead designer for 3rd edition.
Well, you handled that pretty subtly, where you set yourself up as the lead designer for a while when the playtest version of the rules was not up to your standards, and you sort of came in to get us all marching in the right direction, and I think that's right. And then when you backed off, because you were also running the company, you left somebody in charge. Where there, like I said, it had been the 4 of us and no one in charge.
Right.
It was really hard to decide which rule to put in the playtest packet.
Right. So it had to be somebody to break the ties. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And then people didn't mind me so much being in charge because at least it wasn't you. Right. And so that made it so much more acceptable. Whereas if you had just put me in charge, then they would have resented it.
Yeah.
Huh. Better than Peter.
He's smart, right? Yeah.
More like tricky, I think.
Cunning.
Tricksy.
Cunning. Yeah. Well,
resourceful.
There was, we, I felt like we had such a pretty clear idea of things that we wanted to do. I remember one of the things I thought was really important about 3rd edition D&D is that we wanted to move from a system of things you can't do to things you can do.
That's right.
And by the way, I'm sitting here. I'm saying a lot of bad things about AD&D today, and I just want everybody to know. Listen, I loved AD. I mean, AD&D. Even Richard Garfield even said that AD&D was probably, or D&D was the most innovative game ever designed in terms of what games were before D&D and what D&D added to that. So I'm full of praise and love for D&D and AD&D. At the same time, we're like, okay, this is great. Now we got to change all this stuff, right?
That's right.
But in AD&D, there were a lot of things like, oh, you're a dwarf, you can't be a magic user.
You can only go this high in a level.
Don't have these many levels. You could,
you can't multi-class in that combination. You can only multi-class in these combinations. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and one of the guiding lights that I put in place for 3rd edition D&D is I want it to be a game that you can do whatever you want to do. And the first piece of original art I bought for D&D was the Dragon magazine cover. The first Dragon magazine that talked about 3rd edition D&D had the cover was a half-orc paladin.
Yeah, that's right.
And to me, that's what represented what 3rd edition was going to be. Right. So when you look back on working on 3rd edition, because the time flies. We're near the end of our hour. So how do you feel about it now, 20 years later? Do you feel really proud of it?
I feel great about it. I feel great about it. Are there things that we would have done differently if sure. But
another year of playtesting.
And there are some big things that I think we missed, like spellcasting balance and cleric balance. But people loved it, right? Like it did so much combined with the D20 and whatever. It did so much for helping people see how the game works and how the numbers work and what they mean, so that they can invent their own stuff, so they can invent their own D20 stuff, so they can invent other games inspired by how the math works in 3rd edition. I think it just was really, really strong, and it just was an exciting version of Dungeons and Dragons. It was very, we really wanted to make Dungeons and Dragons seem super cool. So we went back to the sort of that 1st edition vibe where stuff was a little bit edgy and cool, a little spiky, right? I'm really happy with it. The sort of small amount of world building that gets implied in what little kind of content there is there, like the race descriptions or the alignment descriptions. I think it was really good, and I think it paved the way for 5th edition, right? 3rd edition streamlined stuff enough that you can then get a handle on things and streamline it even more, which is I think what they did with 5th.
So you pretty positive about 5th?
I am positive about 5th. I would not play it for fun.
Oh, Jonathan.
I wouldn't play 3rd edition for fun anymore. I think.
Okay, that's
right. So, first of all, it's it's so much slower than a game like Everway. In Everway, you can resolve a conflict with one draw from the fortune deck, and you get this card, and you interpret some event, and now you've whatever. And D&D, it's like, all right, well, now you're rolling a 20-sided die. Oh, you hit. All right, you rolled some damage. You got 7 damage. People cheer. Yay, 7 damage. It's like, wow, it just takes forever. And then the balance in D&D is weird because some classes have per day abilities and some pretty much don't. And really what determines how powerful you are is how many rests you get. Yeah. And so that, it's not for me satisfying to play a long combat and know that, well, what really matters is not how well we do in this combat, but whether we can convince the game master to let us rest afterwards. If we can convince the game master to let us rest afterwards, it doesn't matter how we do in this fight because we'll just re-up all our abilities. It'll be fine. Right. And so now whether I rolled 7 damage or 9 damage doesn't matter anyway because we're going to rest after this battle. And so there's, it's just like I have just played D&D.
You just took me back to whole WotC D&D, R&D conversations.
Right? Yeah. So it's just, I have played D&D enough that I have gazed into its inner workings, and I see how it works, and it's hard for me to be playing in a D&D combat and get into it and not be looking at it and thinking about this is not like whether I rolled 7 on that damage die or not, it's not that exciting. It's not interesting enough. I want more to come out of a die roll. So like in Powered by the Apocalypse games, something happens every time you roll the dice, right? There's never a, nothing happens result, which is you get half the time in D&D, it seems like. And so, I just want more action. It's like this. It's like the initiative thing again. I want things to happen faster, and D&D is slow.
So this show's also about Wizards of the Coast.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Just thinking back to your time at Wizards. How do you? It was crazy times.
It was crazy times.
The 90s.
It was like 3 separate crazy times. Right, right, because sort of before '95 was one kind of crazy,
magic,
right? And then and then '95 to '97 was another kind of crazy, and '97 to 2000 wasn't like it was, getting bought.
So looking back, what do you? Altoids.
My bad.
What do you take with you from those years, or your time at Wizards? What have you look back and say? But I really is that too corny of a question for you?
What's your takeaway?
What's your takeaway?
I really I feel like I learned a lot about game design in that whole process. Like I'm revising Everway, and I know a lot more about game design than I did in '95, and the way that the R&D crowd would break down games and analyze them, and was really
brutal at times.
Yeah, brutal and informative, and so I really I feel as though I learned a lot. I learned a lot of things not to do.
Right.
That is also true. Right. There are a lot of lessons learned.
All right. So let's. Before we close, I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about what have you been doing since third edition D&D?
We also mentioned bookending.
Yes.
Remember we mentioned something earlier in the show.
Yes.
We're going to come back to.
Okay. So before we come back to that, I want to say the time that I was working on third edition at home, I was working on Grandmother Fish, and that was a child's book on evolution that was inspired by my daughter, who was born in '94. So, so I was working on a book that would teach evolution to preschoolers, and it took me 15 years. I finally got it right, and now Macmillan has published it, and it's in Chinese and Japanese and Italian. Wow. Yeah, wow. And so it is the first book to teach evolution to preschoolers, and kids really like it. And so that is sort of my completely parallel life, right?
Yeah.
I knew that you had done this. I didn't realize you'd started that long ago.
Yeah, that's right. Because when my daughter Tessa was little, there was no book like this for her, so I figured I needed to write it.
Right. Yeah. Right. All right. So, what else have you been doing? What are you up to now? Designing any games recently?
Yeah. So last year, Over the Edge debuted, and so this is the game that I did in '92, and it was supposed to be unpublishable.
Yeah.
Right.
And I honestly, I had a very free-form combat system that I played in my personal campaign, but I had no way of expressing how to make that work to someone else who would run the game. So I came up with sort of like a hacked system where you make attack rolls versus defense rolls, and you deal damage, and you have hit points, and it's a lot like D&D. And so when I came back to the game to redo it, I overhauled the system, and now sort of like with Everway, where in Everway you can resolve a conflict with a single draw from the fortune deck. In Over the Edge, you have a pair of dice that are the dice you roll for every big conflict, and you cast those lots, and that can be make or break for you on whatever conflict that you have underway. And so it plays super fast.
Right.
And like you had mentioned how when you're playing sort of a new style role-playing game, a story-oriented role-playing game, you can't just throw monsters at the party while you think about what's going to happen next.
Right.
Like and that's what happens with Over the Edge is that the combats go so fast that you just get in twice as much campaigning in a session as with the old version.
So the third edition Over the Edge, it's out.
It's
Atlas
by Atlas.
By Atlas
that's
Games.
right. Full color,
And
big
so,
map.
Nice. And check it out there.
That's right.
That's great. Well, fantastic.
Yeah.
Are there any last parting words? Anything else you want to say?
Any
last words?
See you at Gen Con.
See you at Gen Con. Yes.
Yeah.
You're going to be joining me for Gen Con
That's
this
right.
year. That's great. You going to be at Gen Con this year?
Probably.
I hope so.
Imagine.
Yeah.
Imagine I'll be doing some work there.
Well, everyone's got to be at Gen Con.
Yeah. Well, best 4 days in gaming.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, okay. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's so
Thank you.
great.
Ton of fun.
For being our first episode of Fireside with Peter Adkison, talking about Dungeons and Dragons. So, yes, thanks to our guest, Jonathan Tweet. Thanks to Emma Larkins for being our co-host. Will Geisler is our technical director. And Lauren Bonds, our streaming coordinator, is on site today. And thank you for coming in and watching. Thanks to Chaldea for having this space for us. We will be back in 1 week on February 12th. Our guest will be Ryan Dancy. So we get to hear his side of the whole gamma world. Our boy, Ryan, you should have seen what Jonathan's really still upset about that. So we'll talk about that, I'm sure, and his role in helping us acquire TSR and the whole D20 system and all that sort of stuff like that. But in the meantime, we have a lot of other shows on Gen Con TV. In fact, I had to bring a cheat sheet. Thank you, Lauren, because there's so many things going on. So on Gen Con, Mondays at 6 p.m. now, it used to be 5 p.m., Brothers Murph on board games, and also Fireside next week, as I just talked about, on Wednesdays. We have tonight at 6:30 p.m., and on Wednesday nights, we have a D&D live play, or D&D live play. I'm not sure which edition are they using? Fifth edition D&D. You lose count after a while. It's the Westgate Irregulars, and they're running quite a game. Also Fridays at 11 a.m. Still, we have table takes and the industry new release rundown afterwards, and then also on Friday we'll be releasing a podcast version of Fireside with Peter Adkison. It'll be the first Fireside podcast. Yeah, that's cool. We're branching out too. We're not in Chinese and Japanese yet, but we're getting there. I hope I don't have to learn Chinese. All right, thank you all for joining me. It's great to be with you, and we'll see you next week.